So I have the honor of introducing two of my colleagues, Amy Gorse and Kevin Green, both principal senior leaders of business development for CoreLogic. And they're going to talk about data distribution best practices. So prior to CoreLogic, Amy held various positions at Credential Security, including stints as president and COO. She served as a past member of the CMLS Board of Directors, and prior to Clarity, she was CEO of Intermountain MLS. Amy has nearly 20 years of experience in real estate technology. Her focus areas include organizational, product, process management, including building strong customer service and support processes, building revenue, driving sales, identifying customer pain points, and building solutions to address those. Kevin Green has over 15 years of experience in the industry in a variety of organizations, from running a 2-office brokerage in Jacksonville, Florida, to a stint at Fidelity National Real Estate Solutions, where he was involved in relaunching cyber homes, to vice president of MLS sales for LPS Real Estate Group. Later, he took on a role at Real Estate Digital, senior vice president of business development, managing their MLS division before joining CoreLogic, thankfully, in 2016. Amy and Kevin are both experts on data distribution and deeply involved in Trestle and other strategic CoreLogic initiatives. So please help me welcome them to the stage.
That intro made me sound like I've been here forever. I also want to point out that the Reso colors are my Boise State football team colors. Thanks, Jeremy, for that. Yes. Go ahead, Kevin.
I am not a Mac user.
Arrow.
There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
So, as many of you know, as Ethan said, we've been doing Trestle now for a little over a year and doing a number of installations and setups. And so we're going to talk a little bit about data delivery best practices, but you can't talk about data delivery best practices without saying a little bit about some bad setups, as you can see here. So we've noticed, there's one thing as far as how do you deliver in a processes as far as a Reso data feed, but then how do you do it using what you're currently doing is what we get a lot of questions about. And unfortunately, we're noticing that a lot of people really aren't doing what they should be doing. There's an MLS, we'll protect the innocent or the guilty, we won't say who, but you have an MLS that actually has agents that fill out the data licensing agreement, say who they're going to use, turn it in, and the MLS gives the agent the credentials instead of doing it with the broker, with the vendor. You have another MLS that their filing system, as far as for auditing and tracking, they do the data licensing agreements with the agents and the brokers and the vendors, but they just have stacks of data licensing agreements on their desk. And so when they need to go find one, they got to figure it out. So there's a lot of bad practices out there before we even get started into what's the best way to do a Reso data delivery. So we're going to get into that first, and then we'll get into some other things.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. So when we talk about trying to develop best practices around data distribution, the good news is no one in this room has to start from scratch because a ton of work has been done on this already. And I'll date myself a little bit here. I don't know if any of you were at the CMLS Brings It to the Table in DC in about 2011 when kind of, I say, all heck broke loose, because that's what I'm allowed to say now, but where there were publishers in the room and there were MLSs in the room and everybody was sort of irritated with the state of affairs, right? Data was going places it wasn't supposed to. There was a lot of re-provisioning of data for purposes that were outside of licenses, and it was just, that's to me like where things really, the wild, wild west really got away from us, and I think as a result of that, everyone began to pay much closer attention and began to look at what tools and processes could be improved over time. And so I think Reso was coming into its own about that time and has since matured to the point where standards have become a critical part of what we talk about when we talk about data delivery. Certainly having a solid legal foundation, we're not attorneys up here, so we're not going to speak to that, but I know, Mitch has been around here this week, and there's a lot of people that just work specifically on building that solid legal foundation. It's pretty critical that your agreements match up with what your intent is. And then I would be remiss not to point out, and we'll talk in a little more detail about what the R&D work group here at Reso has already worked on in terms of best practices, and also what CMLS has spent quite a few years working on in terms of best practices around data distribution, just so anybody who's maybe new in here is aware that those sort of resources exist. And then the bottom row is really kind of the 4 categories that we see as critically important to address when you're kind of starting from scratch or even trying to make changes to your existing system. And the first Kevin talked about is sort of the decisions you make at the beginning, right? The setup and the impacts they're going to have along the way. Certainly what you're going to do for compliance is important. We're going to talk specifically about RETS credentials just because of so much we've seen both at CoreLogic and just working at Clarity where we tried to build tools to help customers with compliance. We just saw a lot of scary things, including just basic stuff like a RETS credential not being tied to an agreement, right? So just some stuff that everybody should be aware of. And then, of course, enforcement, which is the hardest part, I think, for most MLSs, because in that case, many times you're coming down on your own member, and kind of just some best practices and ideas around that. So we think about the challenges as they exist today. There's just a lot of friction, right? Because there's this circle of trust, if y'all like that movie, where we talk about the circle of trust, and the MLS, the brokers, the data aggregators, in this case, CoreLogic happens to be one, the data content providers that are publishing data out to consumers are all in the circle of trust. And along the way, when there's inaccuracies in the data, when there's republishing of the data without permission, when there's outdated data out there, there inevitably creates friction in this circle of trust. So every member of the circle has to be participating in the process. And I think that's something sometimes that's been left out along the way. And so we'll talk a little more detail about this as we go along. But really, if you guys think of these 5 people all being participants in this process, I think any policies that you build will get a lot further along.
So then why are standards critical for data distribution? And you know, the big thing is change. So let's think about another industry that had some change and then saw rapid expansion of their technology. Think about analog televisions in the late 90s. You know, it was not mandatory to switch to digital. How many people remember those Sony Trinitron big screen TVs? And if you like football like I do, you really wanted to have one of those behemoths in your house. And it's funny, I just bought a new house and they actually had cut out a piece of the wall to fit that thing in there. So there really was not a big change as far as in TVs and the technology from an analog standpoint. And while HD was out there and they sold a few of them, those plasmas were $10,000 until they actually, the government mandated that they switched all their feeds to digital instead of analog. And now all of a sudden you got 4K TVs and everything. I think TVs are, you know, you can get a 46-inch TV for $200 and you can practically throw them away when they're wrong. So change can be good, especially in technology, and because it enables rapid innovation. So by having those standards and being able to do that with APIs and that allows for rapid innovation. And as you heard those folks this morning and the technology providers and vendors on stage that showed how much time it saved them from development time, it reduces support and compliance efforts. So it really gives you an opportunity to save some money and time and put some things in different areas. And then again, it improves security, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, Amy will, as far as from an API standpoint, and you know, you're pulling what you need, so it's really good.
So this is just some of, and I certainly don't want to cover every bullet that's on the screen, but we wanted to bring awareness to some of the best practices documents that were already out there. Again, some of them coming from CMLS and some of them coming from Reso specifically. But I think these are, you know, sort of worth considering as you're setting up your policies. And to Kevin's point, some of what we've been doing in the 60 days since I've been at CoreLogic and working with Matt Cohen, who many of you know, and I know you miss him this week, I miss him too, he had some commitments otherwise, is really taking a look at what sort of tools we can provide to you all as data distributors, whether you're a broker or more primarily probably whether you're an MLS, and what sort of tools and reports we can provide that help you enforce some of this, some of these requirements. So, you know, when we think about Reso standards and things like that, it's important that the tools that you're using, whether it's Trestle or something else, support your policies. Otherwise, as you all know, they become very hard to enforce, right? And we enforce by complaint, which gets us into trouble sometimes as well. So just talking about some of the CMLS best practices here, again, I don't want to read all these bullets, but when you think about your data licensing agreements, they should address scope and access to the licensed data, certainly some protections, what your fees are going to be, what compliance means, and if you have some specific things you're going to do as a part of compliance, those should be disclosed in the agreement, right? That way there's no surprises along the way. Either brokers or technology providers understand up front exactly what they can expect from your compliance department, and we get away from, again, sort of that, you're picking on me because I'm an alternative model. So the more consistent you are, I think, the more important these things become. Certainly warranties and representations and all of the legal information is pretty critically important as well. And then again, carrying on with actual security best practices, these are just, to me, sort of minimum viable product policies, right? So everyone has a basic expectation that these kind of things happen when you license your data. But shockingly, they do not in many cases. And so we've seen at the highest level, right, what breaches and leakage and things like that look like. And so rather than making assumptions, it's our recommendation that things like this be spelled out in your agreements, right? If you have an anti-scraping policy and you require some sort of tool, you better be doing that on your own public website too. That's where we've seen sort of, you know, the standard of practice for where you're licensing your data can't really reasonably be tighter than what you're doing as a standard of practice in your own house. So things around, we're gonna talk a little bit about RETS credentials and credential security and encryption and things that, you know, frankly are pretty technical, but to me, it's on all of us to expect more from the tools that are supporting this, right? We're really good as an industry at writing policy. No offense, but I've seen a lot of policy written and a lot of talk. But it's time for the technology to follow along with the policy. And if I'm just being really frank, it's time for us to kind of step up and expect that someone along the way is going to pay for that, whether it's through your data licensing agreements or whatever. You know, this kind of stuff, sort of securing the data, isn't free, and you can't only manage by saying no anymore, right? That horse has sort of left the barn. So we talk about compliance and enforcement, policies around content retention, how long they're allowed to keep things, when your compliance reviews are going to occur, right? And if it's random, disclose that it's random, but then just be really careful about how random is. Random isn't, I go and check when someone complains, right? So just be aware of that. And then, you know, if there's requirement for them to notify you of significant changes or things like that, you know, have that be a part of your license agreement.
So, you know, as Amy goes through all of that, you got to, using all of that as a roadmap per se is a great way to do a setup. And so as Amy mentioned, it's having one agreement per customer, you know, so it's funny, a lot of people think that, you know, I want to have a data licensing agreement and a data feed for all of, per agent to use that. how much space does that take up from a server standpoint? You know, we talked about high-res photos in the last session before lunch, and think about that and how much of all those high-res photos take up from a server standpoint. And then the other thing from a compliance standpoint, isn't it better, wouldn't you find it better if you find them out of compliance and you have to turn off their feed? It's not just, does not affect one agent, it affects 10 agents, which also affects that vendor's pocketbook. So that really is as far as being able to manage that, it's a lot easier. So it's really good. And so as you see that agreements are also tied to the data provider itself. Not the agent, as I mentioned before, from a best practice standpoint. We're really not even the broker, because who's the one that's actually housing and consuming the data? It's the vendor. The vendor, the technology provider, is really the ones that is actually having housing and distributing that data on that broker or agent's behalf. They're the ones that do it, so you really should have them as far as tie that agreement directly to the vendor that's using it. And then management of license agreements includes all the details necessary for easy compliance reviews. As Amy was just talking about, compliance is a huge part of this. You know, you can have a legal agreement that sets it up, but the other thing is having a system in place and tools that help you in compliance is very, very important. And then doing that on having a schedule. I know as Amy says, if you want to do it random, but really should you do it random? Because then when randomness, as far as not on a monthly basis or something, but as literally I'd check once a year, it doesn't really set a good regimen of going through it, and can lead to some problems down the road. And then, I can't read. Re-signing new versions or addendum is easy, and compliance with this requirement is easy to monitor. That's a big thing, is having tools to be able to do that is very important. And so that you can easily refer back to who is using those data licensing agreements and where that is. And then payments of fees in a secure, compliant, and easy to monitor manner. You know, it's nice to have e-commerce now. I think it's really good to be able to do that on a regular basis.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. So when we talk about compliance monitoring, some of you may have remembered that Matt Cohen and I built a tool a while back called Safe Syndication, right? It was sort of in response to that. Listen, we don't even know where to begin checking, right? And so we did integrations with a few data content aggregators, and it gave a little bit of visibility. And it also gave you some tools to kind of go out and do IDX website monitoring. And Matt still does a lot of IDX website compliance reviews and things like that for a lot of customers. But regardless of how you decide to do it, the first thing you should do is establish a process for determining when the data consumers undergo a review. If it's before they launch, you know, just something that's fair and equitable, because universally sort of what I keep hearing is, you know, the MLS lets their regular Joe Blow members get away with everything, but I'm a new guy, so I'm getting picked on. Or, you're a new vendor that I don't know anything about, so I'm going to hold you to a different level than my buddies over at, I'll pick on Michael if he's in the room, homes.com. I get that those reviews might be easier, and that's okay if the reviews are easier for homes.com, because you know. But consistent application of that policy and documentation of that is critical. I think that people inside your brokerages, people inside technology providers are starting to pay attention to this sort of thing. And so it's just pretty critically important that you have policies that address specifically what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and ideally you'll have some compliance tools that are built in or integrated with your data distribution platform. It's certainly a goal for me when Kevin and Ethan and Chris asked me to help work on Trestle. I looked at the platform, I thought, this is great, we're tying contracts, right? People got out of the file drawer, right? We have contracts tied to data feeds, you can't get one without the other. It's awesome, but we're still missing a few pieces around some real compliance tools that help you go out and check with your data content providers to ensure they're in compliance. So we're definitely working on that over the next couple of quarters at CoreLogic. So when we talk about RETS credential, I think I stole your slide, sorry Kevin, I talk a lot, kick me off. We talk about RETS credential usage policies. We really struggle with this one internally, Matt and I do. because you definitely don't want them reusing them over and over and over, to Kevin's point about tying specific credentials to a license, and also the idea that they're going to go get the data 10 times because they have 10 websites is sort of ridiculous, right? But at the same time, if you're using things like watermarking and data seeding and stuff like that, it's certainly more effective when they have single creds. So we struggle with it a little bit. We don't see watermarking and data seeding being the only solution. Can it help? Sure. Should we be doing it? Probably. But it's so far from the only solution that I see really auditing and enforcement and beginning to build some sophisticated tools around detecting behavior, right? So we're used to this at the Clarity side. We've gotten super good at detecting end user behavior, and when it looks suspicious, we should be doing the exact same thing on the RETS credential side. And so when we start to look at creating a fingerprint, right, for what we're used to seeing from a RETS user, then we can tell you when something doesn't look right. And I think we should be doing that. I think certainly being more careful about tracking the use of API keys to mitigate any faking or interception. I can't believe we still have to talk about TLS as an implementation best practice, but we do. So there's just some really, I think, solid recommendations around RETS credential use that would clean things up. Today, as Kevin mentioned, when we take on a trestle implementation and a customer's interested in moving people over, I'm amazed at how many folks don't move because they don't exist anymore, right? But there's active credentials that have been out there, maybe the same person's not even using them, there's no license tied to them. Those kind of things I think we have to do better at.
Yeah, we'll go back to the bad setup for a moment. We actually did a recent implementation, just so that you know, and they thought they had 400 vendors that were on the getting the feeds, and really it ended up being 175. That's how many bad credentials were floating out there. So it's really, really important.
Yeah. You guys are welcome for 3 slides of RETS best practices credential security. Can you tell Matt Cohen wrote a few slides for me? 3 slides on how to secure your RETS credentials. So the good news is these slides are available. I'm not going to spend a ton of time. But again, I think there's more that we can do to help you. I think there's more that you can do when you're managing your own RETS servers to just pay attention, even if you're manually auditing some of this. It's important to know, to the extent that you can lock down IP addresses, things like that are all going to be kind of critical components to getting it back under control. It's not just, like I said, I don't think it's just watermarking and data seeding that's going to help you. I think you're going to have to kind of lock it down from getting out errantly to begin with. And then it makes enforcement and monitoring much easier because you're not chasing ghosts, right? You're chasing known data license content providers.
So best practices in enforcement. As Amy said, and I kind of reiterated, first off, I don't know if it's number 2 there, it's consistency. I think consistency is very critical in having a written policy. I can't emphasize that enough because it really shows what you're doing, and it allows those bad actors to know that you mean business. And so it's going to actually do a lot of preventative maintenance on its own instead of being able to do that. But penalties also should fit the crime, and you need to make sure that you do that and be in a consistent basis, especially, and also who does the crime. Is that, as I mentioned before, that's the one thing that was very interesting to me, and when we talked about the bad setups, is when you have a data license that's directly tied to an agent and not a vendor, how are you going to go after the vendor? It's not really the agent didn't really do the crime. It was the vendor. So it's really important that you have those written documents that's written out, and also who's going to get penalized, and it fits the crime of who does it. It's not the agent. A lot of times it is the technology provider. And then you mitigate enforcement through education and clear documentation. That's just what I said. It's going to help stop a lot of things just from ever happening as long as you have those written policies and you do things on a regular basis. And then while assessing penalties, a member, be aware of the MLS policy guidelines. That's very, very important. As Amy said, we write a lot of policies, but a lot of times we don't enforce them either. There's a reason why they're out there and looking up in the best practices from CMLS or Reso or NAR is the best thing to do is the first stop. And then the responsibility of it discovered that content consumer has experienced a breach. It is very important to do that. I mean, that's the reason for having those audits, and getting platform or having a platform of delivering data that helps you audit is extremely important. It's one thing to provide the data out there in a secure manner, but if you don't can't audit it, how do you know where it's going? And so that's the one thing that we've been very diligent at Trestle of being able to do, that is allowing creating some reports and stuff for you to be able to make that easier for you, and then doing that a lot more in the roadmap, and we're really excited about that.
I'm just curious, of the MLSs in the room, how many of you have sort of a written compliance policy that ties back to your data licenses and does it get published to your vendors? Do you all publish it? Yeah. How many have gone back, bonus question, and updated to their policy to reflect any differences that might exist for Web API? Probably not very many of us. But there are some subtle differences when you think about it. And so it's not set it and forget it. It's sort of constantly evolving based on changes in technology, based on things you learn during compliance reviews, because somebody will always find a loophole. So it's sort of that constant reevaluation of your policy, closing whatever loophole exists, continuing to iterate on it nonstop. And so I really think of these policies as kind of living, breathing documents, as opposed to traditionally what I've seen from us as MLSs, I'm guilty of it as well, is I hire an attorney to help me write a policy that I think ties to our agreement, right? And then it sits there. And so when you think about just the changes that have come about as a result of the Web API and things like that, there's probably not anybody in this room that doesn't need to spend a little time revisiting their policy if you're in compliance with Reso and offering a Web API.
So how many people, I'm gonna ask a bonus question now. So how many people have given out a Reso data feed, and because of that have changed what their policy is and examined how they're delivering data? Nobody. I think in the earlier session you might have heard, it's hard to make change. We talked about that, but there's different ways of, as you say, instead of catching up, sometimes it's catching on. I'm stealing Amy's saying. I'm liking working with her and learning some new things like the paycheck fairy. But one of the things that there are different best practices also as far as doing that. And so you have sometimes it's kind of hard to move everybody over right away and rip the Band-Aid off. One of the best practices is, let's do anybody new, we're gonna get them on here and create a nice transition plan, and being able to do that. So you don't have to go through the pain of switching, maybe a phantom 400 vendors from the one MLS that we talked about. And you might find something, if you do rip off the Band-Aid, because you might find that you did have a phantom 125 vendors that just were not there. So there's always different ways to do it, but I think the catching on part is a really easy way to start utilizing standards, especially from an IDX standpoint, because it's pretty straightforward with an IDX agreement. And whatever fees and functionalities you have, to be able to just have any new folks getting onto the standard.
Yep. Cool. I think we're
fast today. So that gets into the suite setup. So you might have saw the first setup that was pretty bad. That gets into the suite setup. So I think everybody would, if anybody's a Star Wars fan out here, the new movie comes out December 15th, that you'll have, what is the best practice of setting up your data distribution methods. And I think now is a great time, as mentioned, when moving over to delivering with the Reso standard, to look at what you're doing and create some best practices.
Anybody have sort of comments or questions? Anybody willing to share what they've done in the last year to sort of address these sort of things? I'm curious as much, I guess, from the place of talking to customers over the last 3 or 4 weeks. And frankly, I get that some of you may not want to talk about it in a group, but frankly, some of your reluctance, right? You're just kind of like, well, I'll deal with it when a broker comes and knocks on my door and says I have to. But on the flip side, we're sort of hearing brokers saying, they're just dragging their feet, or they're, plain old telling us no, or things like that. If we're just talking about kind of what the challenges and barriers are, what are some things this group can help with? Thoughts? Trying to fill up 10 minutes here, y'all. Yay, I knew Rachel. Come on.
Well, it's interesting that the past couple of years it's become clear to us because we've invested a lot of time and resources and money in creating all these contracts and everything. So we have all these vendors who contact us and say, I want an IDX feed or I want a VOW feed, as if those are the only two feeds that exist.
Yeah.
And we've had to learn to ask a whole series of questions to find out what it is they're going to do with the feed, because apparently in a lot of markets, those are the only two feeds that are available. And we do a lot of custom feed design
Right.
and setup, and so when they call and they say, well, just give me the IDX. Well, you're not providing IDX.
Right.
So, no, we're not going to just give you an IDX.
Yeah, I do think IDX and VOW, because they are mandated, right, tend to be the two minimum viable I'm an MLS sort of products that you have to offer. So that's probably why you're hearing a lot of that. I guess a question back to you based on custom feeds is, what's your approach to compliance when they're getting custom feeds, and what they can do with those? Like, how are you, controlling display preferences, anything like that?
Custom feeds, none of those can be made available to the general public. They're only in-house.
So broker back office, kind of, yeah.
Back office, they could be analytics stuff. And obviously, the controls are much tighter if it's all in MLS data as opposed to just that office's data.
Right,
Because, an office that wants to request their own data from back office is obviously going to take care of that information.
right. How many people that are running an MLS have more than 2 feed types? More than 3? Keep your hands up. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I sort of theorized about this too, right? That even within IDX, there's some granularity that maybe we're not aware of yet. But it's interesting to me, if there isn't policy and licensing attached to that, what's the difference? So it's just more something to think about. I think we all built this over time from a place of, in my old market, Intermountain MLS, Glenn, you're out here somewhere, right? We were doing feeds to brokers before IDX was even a thing, right? Because we had a John L. Scott in our market, and a Windermere, and Northwest MLS had done it, so we were already doing that. So then to go back when there was an IDX policy and try to tell broker, well, you can't have those anymore because they're not required. I'm not doing that, So I do think some of these have sort of come about, these custom feeds have come about as a result of us, kind of an unwillingness, frankly, to go back and try to bring people into compliance, and I totally get it. But, it's just something to think about as you're creating your compliance policies and your licensing. The more you have, the more complicated it is, and I think that's okay. And if it's broker back office, it's a little different. But just something to think about. Like, if you're just letting it go with not a lot of rules around it, and then wonder how to fix it later, it's almost too late. So, other comments and questions? Steve Bird, don't sleep on me. You got nothing.
I doubt that.
All right, Jeremy, we're letting your stage go early unless you want Kevin to dance. Okay. Jeremy has a question.
What happens if you're an MLS certified and you refuse to give a qualifying request for access to a standardized feed?
So I think you could probably answer your own question better than I can, since you're the certifier. Yeah. But from our perspective, and I do believe this kind of came up at the board of directors earlier this week, from our perspective, part of what certifies you is your agreement to provide a feed. So if you agree but then never do it, you're out of compliance. And we will we'll work with Jeremy as close as we can to try to bring you into compliance, but ultimately it's your responsibility, right? We can certify the data at CoreLogic, that the data is compliant, and that there's a feed sitting there ready to go. Kevin says, I can lead the horse to water, but I cannot make him drink. He called y'all horses. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I mean, I think that's just something to consider. We're hearing some of that. I know Jeremy's hearing some. We're hearing some too, just from the vendor side of things, because of the trestle offering. So I think it's just be prepared to communicate what your policy is, because I think sort of just ignoring the request isn't going to be a viable option for the future.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do with Trestle specifically is, provide you with a first-class tool to be able to get certified and deliver those feeds. And then the tool also is from a compliance standpoint, secure standpoint, and that, as Amy said, I can provide those tools, but we got to get you to use them, and that's the big thing. So, we can help you get certified, but part of that certification process is actually being the willingness to deliver a data feed.
Totally. Thanks.